Do you feel a shiver up your spine from fear? Yes, it's another story from the Nightshade diary. You know what that means. Check under the bed and make sure no one or nothing is there. Is the closet door securely shut? Then leave your disbelief behind. Amp up your imagination and hang on tight for another ride into terror and mystery. And like all good horror stories, just imagine it's a dark and stormy night. And remember, screaming like a little girl is permitted. The Chadwick Pit by Carl Jacobi. Chadwick walked slowly up the lane and gazed with satisfaction at his property. The more he saw of it, the more he considered it a stroke of luck. It wasn't often that one could buy 10 acres of land and a house of his particular needs for the small amount he had paid. He had wanted a house, modern, yet with an architecture of the past, in an isolated location where he could continue the recluse-like existence he had led in the city. Owego House answered all those wants. Owego. It was an Indian name, he had been told. Seen through a copse of cedars, the house looked friendly and inviting, with a wide veranda, oversized burgundy shutters, and a new substantial roof tile. Then Chadwick's gaze turned 50 yards east. If Owego was an odd name for a house, Dead Man's Pit was an appropriate name for the great sinkhole that marked the end of his property. Here were rank weeds, thorn bushes, and ragged outcroppings. In the center of this wasteland was a deep depression, filled with water so black it didn't even reflect the sky. The borders were strewn with rocks. Sight of the place depressed Chadwick, and he turned back down the lane toward the house. In the driveway, his parked station wagon reminded him that his weekly trip to town for supplies was overdue. He got into the car and headed toward Blacktop 3. In Chaska, he parked and went to several shops, where he talked very little to the tradespeople. In the hardware store, however, he found conversation pressed upon him. "How do you like your new place?" the hardware man said as he packaged the nails Chadwick had purchased. "I like it all right," Chadwick said. "It's a nice house," the man said, "considering that it's been there close to 100 years. I thought 100 years ago this was all Indian country." The man rang up the register. "Farther north, maybe. Not here. But that pit on your place was once an old Indian burial mound. The first two owners dug it all up, looking for treasure or something." "Did they find any?" Chadwick asked. "I don't think so. The first was before my time, but he's supposed to have shot himself. Accidentally. The second just went away and never came back. Nobody ever saw or heard of him." Chadwick turned to go. "Well, it's an eyesore," he said. "I suppose I'll have it filled up one of these days." The man's face darkened perceptibly. "I don't think I'd do that," he said. "If I were you, I'd just leave it alone." Chadwick went out to his car, musing over the merchant's words. He tossed his packages into the rear seat. The August street was hot and sultry, and by contrast the library on the opposite corner, a block away, shaded by a couple of elms, looked cool and inviting. On impulse, he crossed the street, walked the block, and climbed the steps. Inside, to the girl behind the desk, he said, "I'd like some information on the building of a summer house. Plans, pictures, anything you have." She was gone almost 10 minutes. When she returned, she looked at Chadwick with interest. "You rarely hear of such things anymore. Are you planning to build one yourself?" She was attractive in a fragile way, with long dark hair and lustrous eyes. It had been a long time since Chadwick had been attracted to a girl, but now he felt himself talking without restraint. She was a ready listener. Before leaving, he learned her name, Emily Hunter. With a lighter step than he had known in years, he went out again into the blazing street. Chaska was an old town built along the Minnesota River, a German settlement with a characteristic neatness evident on all sides. Its streets were redolent with the summer musk from the bottomlands. The county seat courthouse faced the center park, and as Chadwick strode past, a heavy-set, red-faced man with a wide-brimmed hat came out and hailed him. It was the sheriff, Tom Blunt. "Just wondered how you were getting along," Blunt said, lighting a cigar with a kitchen match. I'm okay, Chadwick said. You figuring on staying in your new place alone? I don't suppose there's any law that says a man has to have a regiment around him, Chadwick replied testily. Blunt grinned. No law. Only your place is pretty far out. I'm used to being alone. What are you figuring on doing with the pit? What do you mean, what am I going to do with it? Well, it's a dangerous place. The Caston boy drowned there a year ago. He'd been studying anthropology and he was looking for relics. All this talk about what he considered the one disagreeable feature of his property irritated Chadwick. I suppose I'll have it filled up, he said. It was the second time that day he had made that statement, and for the second time it prompted an odd reply. I don't think it's necessary to do that, Blunt said quickly. Why don't you just fence it off and put up a few warning signs? Chadwick said that he would consider the matter, and as soon as he decently could, he broke away, returned to his car, and headed back for home. For several weeks after that he busied himself repairing the veranda railing. Some of the rungs had rotted out, tidying up the grounds, and poring over the construction books that Emily had selected for him. It was true that he had wanted a summer house for a long time. Such a building had lingered in his memory since childhood, and it was a desire for one that had been a major reason behind his move from the city. He decided to build a conventional structure with a stonework lower portion and a screened upper part open to the air. Most of the material he could obtain in Chaska. The stones for the lower portion were available close at hand, in the pit. He went to the sinkhole, selected the stones with care, and trundled them in a barrow to the house grounds. The work was hard, and he was disconcerted to find himself so completely exhausted. Not only did he have tired muscles, but the task, particularly while he was in the pit, for some reason affected his eyes. Once he fancied he saw a head-shaped rock in the center come to life and move toward him. And once, when he peered down into the black water, he thought he saw an elongated shadow like a sea serpent writhe and twist just below the surface. But all his troubles vanished several weeks later, when the summer house, with the aid of two Chaska youths, was finally completed. Quickly the building molded itself into his life. He began to spend the long summer afternoons there. A strange quality of contentment fell over him as he sat at the little iron table in the circular room, drinking juleps from a frosty glass. He installed a couch and passed the sultry night stretched out upon it. To his surprise, he found that sleep, which had always been a problem with him, now came with ease. His sleep, however, was marred by dreams. Like all men, Chadwick had had his share of dreams since childhood, and as with most persons, these dreams were usually disconnected, distorted, and marked by complete lack of logic. Now, however, they were different. Though he could remember no details, he now retained three impressions upon awakening: search, flight, and pursuit by persons or things unknown. What he was searching for was not clear. Sometimes it was for a jungle beast, sometimes a composite, always female. The flight followed immediately, whether the search was successful or not. He fled panic-stricken with leaden feet, unable to run or hurry. The pursuit was a relentless thing that followed him, and constituted a horror from which he knew there was no escape. These dreams formed a cohesive unit. Two, that is, the action continued chronologically from one night to another. But the aspect that was incredible, which he could not at first make himself believe, was the fact that these dreams came only when he slept in the summer house. On those occasions, when he spent the night in the house bedroom, the sequence was broken, and he either did not dream at all, or his sleeping fantasies were the usual blind, meaningless affairs of before. Sometimes he awoke in the middle of the night, bathed in perspiration, shaking with fear, to discover odd things, the door unlocked, or his clothes piled in a disorderly heap in the middle of the floor. Yet the very anticipation of those dreams affected him like an opiate, and he could not force himself to stay away from the summer house. On a morning following several nights, when the dreams had been particularly enervating, Chadwick was on his veranda when Sheriff Blunt drove up. "In the neighborhood," Blunt said, "so I thought I'd stop by." Seen any strangers around? I haven't seen anybody, Chadwick said. Then you haven't heard what happened the last few days? Chadwick shook his head. I haven't been to town in more than a week. Well, we've had a murder, Blunt said, and a disappearance, which might well be a second. Chadwick stared. We found Jim Evans' wife. He's the Chaska jeweler, strangled in a ditch along 41. And Irene Trask hasn't been seen since Wednesday night. I've got 2 deputies working round the clock, Blunt continued, but so far we haven't come up with anything. You better keep an eye out living all alone out here. Chadwick got up and walked to the end of the veranda. He came back slowly and sat down again. A distant look entered his eyes. A long time ago, he said haltingly. It must have been around 55. I did a hitch on the Chicago police force. That's ancient history, of course, but I'd be glad to help in any way I can. Blunt nodded. I might take you up on that, he said. Did you know a detective sergeant named Fallon? I think he was in Chicago about that time. I don't recall the name. In spite of the police background that he had mentioned, Chadwick was disturbed by the sheriff's warning. After Blunt had gone, he began a search of his grounds, although he had no idea what he was looking for. The doom which had seemed to lie in wait for him in his dreams now became almost a reality. He was chagrined to find himself glancing over his shoulder at every wind-tossed clump of foliage. In the back of the house, facing the direction of the pit, he found one of the lower windows open. But there was no footprints near, so he attributed it to his own negligence. There were, however, footprints leading to the driveway where he parked his car. Not far away was a little pile of cigarette stubs, as if someone had stood there a long time. Then he saw they were his brand and realized that he must have forgotten being there. His car gave him more concern. Though he couldn't be sure, the gas supply seemed less and the odometer reading more than when he had last driven. But it would have been impossible for anyone to have taken the car without awakening him, even though the driveway was some distance from the house. He gave a vague impression of night driving and of walking in the darkness. But this, he knew, was only a residue of his summer house dreams. For years, he had never gone any place after sundown. The loneliness of his property began to weigh on him. He had the unpleasant feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. On Friday, he drove to Chaska. The town was in a state of excitement. The body of the missing girl, Irene Trask, had been found strangled, and there was another disappearance. Sheriff Blunt stood on the courthouse steps talking to his deputies and a state police officer. Chadwick went into the library to return the construction books. He found Emily Hunter almost in a state of hysteria. She told them the missing girl, Mary Philbin, was one of her closest friends. I can't understand why anyone would want to harm her, she said. She was liked by everybody. A tall, thin girl with reddish hair? Yes. Do you know her? He shook his head. I've probably seen her around town. In an effort to calm her, he changed the subject and talked of casual things. She quieted and smiled a little. Anyone would know you're bachelor, she said. You're wearing one black sock and one brown. And you really should stay out of the mud, Mr. Chadwick. Tell me, did you finish your summer house? Chadwick nodded. Yes, but I'm afraid the job was a little too much for me. I had help on all except the stonework. Where did you get the stones? In the pit. That's a sort of sinkhole on my property. Her face clouded. Yes, I know the pit. You shouldn't have taken the stones from there, Mr. Chadwick. Why not? She fingered her pendant. Let's just say it isn't a healthy place. It has an evil reputation. Yes, I know, Chadwick said. The Caston boy drowned there a year ago, but he was... Billy Caston was one of the finest swimmers in Carver County. Back home, Chadwick tried to think more of his days as a police officer. He had told Blunt that he was on the Chicago force in '55, but he could recall little of that work save a few trips in a prowl car, and even those were hazy, like the recollection of an old gangster movie. It now occurred to him that there were still some parts of his house that he had not fully examined. It seemed to him as good a time as any to do a little exploring. He took a flashlight and descended to the cellar. There were actually two cellars, one opening off the other, but there was nothing in either except a plenitude of cobwebs and some empty boxes. He went up to the second floor and prowled down the corridor. Toward the rear he came upon a room he had not entered before. Here a wan shaft of sunlight filtered through a dirty pane to reveal a few pieces of discarded furniture and a carpet gray with dust. About to leave he saw a large cabinet, almost hidden by a pile of draperies. It was filled with books. Chadwick stepped closer and ran his eyes over the titles. They were a curious assortment. Many were cheap novels of a generation ago, but there were also a few authoritative volumes on psychology, psychic research, strange myths, and primitive beliefs. One of the last bore the title, The Prehistoric Hopewell Culture. Chadwick riffled through the pages. He stopped at a passage marked with a pencil check. Quote, an utterly strange culture preceded the North American Indian by several thousand years. It was unique for its complex burial mounds and its so-called cult of the dead. It is the warnings of this cult of the dead which have come down to us through the mist of the past. Defilers of the burial mounds were promised all the avenging horrors of the culture's diabology. Chadwick closed the book thoughtfully. He selected several psychology volumes which at the moment were of more interest to him and carried them downstairs. He had become increasingly concerned with dreams the last few days, and each of the books had one or more chapters on this subject, for his nightmares in the summer house had grown more and more disturbing. Although he could still remember no specific details, upon awakening, the three impressions, search, flight, and pursuit, continued. Now the search was intensified, a powerful urge to seek out something. The flight, too, was more frantic, and the pursuit was a nameless terror that followed him relentlessly. These dreams were debilitating, too. They left Chadwick exhausted, almost as if he had not slept at all. Yet, though he knew that he had only to move from the summer house to end them, somehow he couldn't do that. It was as if he were taking a stimulant, sweet, bitter, unpleasant, habit-forming. Later on, a cheerless morning 3 days after his trip to Chaska, he was awakened by a distant pistol shot. 10 minutes later, Sheriff Blunt appeared at the edge of his grounds, followed by one of his deputies. Thought we saw him, Blunt said disgustedly, but it was only this jacket hanging on a bush. We traced him across Barlow's swamp, Blunt continued. He seemed to be heading to the pit. Then Jake here saw the jacket and took a shot. The trail was cold. Have you seen anyone? Not a soul, Chadwick said. Have there been any more killings? Blunt looked at his deputy and frowned. No, he said. No more murders, but another disappearance. I believe you know her. The Hunter girl. Chadwick's jaw went slack. Not Emily, he cried. The girl who works in the library? He made fist of his hands. Blunt, he said after a long moment of silence, you've got to deputize me. If you don't, I'll go on my own. The sheriff nodded sympathetically. All right, he said. I understand. After Blunt had gone, Chadwick went into his house and looked for his revolver. He found a gun. It wasn't a police special, but an old Webley Scott automatic. Outside, he got into a station wagon and drove fast to Blacktop 3. There were 1,000 places he could search. Emily Hunter lived close to Chaska on 41, but almost automatically he headed in the opposite direction, toward the Victoria Cutoff. He didn't know why he did this. He had never driven the cutoff, yet a recollection of this road seemed to come to him. His mind seethed. If only it had been someone else. The thought struck him that his actions now were repetitive, like scenes from a movie run many times, and then abruptly the spell was broken. He looked upon his surroundings with complete unfamiliarity. Puzzled, he turned the car and headed for home. In the central room he buried his head in his hands. He must do something. He must think. From the table he took up one of the psychology books he had brought down from the little room upstairs. As if it had been read many times at that place, The book fell open to the chapter on dreams. Half unconsciously, Chadwick began to read. The dream is the least understood part of the human psyche. The distortion, irrationality, and lack of logical coherence which characterize many of them is no doubt the result of a multitude of subliminal perceptions and is almost impossible to explain. He turned a page. No interpretation of the dream can be made without liberal references to mythology, folklore, and primitive beliefs such as witchcraft, lycanthropy, etc. It is a curious fact that the dreamer need have no prior knowledge of these Kabbalah. They are universal in their distribution. Chadwick discarded the book and took up another. It too opened of its own accord to the dream chapter. In 1945, the Belgian Anatole Armand quoted the case of a man who, while asleep, not only noctambulated a considerable distance, but also lived a life completely divorced from his waking hours. Yet he had no knowledge of that life. To offset this, he created for himself a fantasy past. Such cases are extremely rare, and it is thought that only some malignant influence could induce such a condition. Chadwick's eyes drifted from the page to the table. There, where he had emptied his pockets upon coming in from outside, were a couple of objects he didn't remember seeing before. A length of window sash cord with each end carefully bound with tape to prevent fraying, and a short piece of rounded wood with a wide, deep notch cut about 6 inches from one end. He looked at them, puzzled, for the moment unable to explain their presence. It was now several hours since Sheriff Blunt had told him about Emily Hunter, and he suddenly realized he had done absolutely nothing. A confused picture flashed before his inner eye of her, standing at his side, now running before him. He gathered up his things from the table, went back out to his car, and headed for Chaska. He seemed to be viewing his surroundings through a prism, with everything strange and out of proportion. At the town outskirts, a car suddenly pulled diagonally across the road in front of his, blocking the way. The sheriff emerged and approached. "Oh, it's you. We're stopping all cars. Where are you heading, Chadwick?" Chadwick spread his hands on the wheels. "Well, there's no sense to our driving two cars," Blunt said. "I'll go along with you." He walked back, drove his car into the far side of the road, and a moment later climbed in beside Chadwick. Uncertainly, Chadwick shifted gears. For some time he drove in silence, then he burst into speech. "We can't just go blind. You must have some idea." "No, I haven't." The sheriff's face was immobile. "We don't know if Emily Hunter is alive or dead. We do know that with the other two victims there was an interlude of about 40 hours between the time of their disappearance and their death. We know that both were kept alive in one place and then taken somewhere else to be murdered. I'm hoping the killer will keep to the same schedule. If he does, we may have a small margin of time left." "Why would he do that?" Chadwick heard himself ask. The sheriff shrugged. "There's no explaining a psychotic killer. I figure he can just go far in his lust for blood, then he cools. When the urge comes upon him again, he goes back and finishes the job. But why 40 hours? After a day and a night? I suppose he's got to sleep." Blunt was a fool, Chadwick thought. A busybody and a fool. Not even a good sheriff. The car swung past Houseman's Woods. When another fork appeared, he swung into it. "Now you're going in a circle." "I know." Chadwick did not say that a strange compulsion was guiding his movements. "When you were in Chicago, did you ever run into a case of this kind?" The sheriff seemed to be talking only to pass the time. "No." "Know anything about fingerprints?" "I know Bertillon discovered them." "How about ballistics?" Chadwick shook his head. "Most premeditated criminals don't use guns anymore. They use too much noise and bullets can be traced. They prefer a knife." "Knives can be traced too," Chadwick said. "I suppose so," Blunt said, "but that pretty well exhausts the field." "There's the garrote." Chadwick's words were automatic. "Oh, yes, the garrote. But I'd hardly call that a weapon, would you?" "Yes, I would," Chadwick said. "It goes back to the 15th century. In Spain, it was a method of injuring the spinal cord at the base of the brain. I didn't know that. Have you done much reading along those lines? It used to be my hobby, Chadwick said. Blunt expelled a mouthful of smoke. Where are we? Oh yes, the old Lake Virginia road. It comes to the pit from the other side, Chadwick said. Nobody uses it anymore. The road was deep, rutted, and the willows along the narrow shoulders pressed close. Presently the forlorn wasteland that was the pit opened before them. It was a different view than Blunt was accustomed to seeing. From this angle the loneliness of the place was almost pronounced. The piles of rock were larger, and the black water left only a thin corridor for the car to pass. Then this too ended, and Blunt understood why the road was no longer used. It should be posted dead end, he thought. Chadwick stopped the car. He got out, and like an automaton, body stiff, muscles unflexed, began to pace slowly along the water's edge. His gait was shambling, uneven. He stared straight ahead with all the fixed intensity of a sleepwalker. Quietly, Blunt began to follow a few steps behind. And now what seemed like Chadwick's destination looked up, an ugly cairn of black boulders fashioned by nature into a grotto-like structure with a jagged opening on one side and a roof formed by an up-tilted rock slab. Suddenly, with a hoarse cry, Chadwick stopped and turned. "Over there!" he cried. "Behind you! Back of that rock!" Even as Blunt spun around in obedience to the command, he realized his mistake. But before he could move, a rope encircled his throat, twisted tight with lightning rapidity, and choked off his windpipe. The garrote. He jerked both hands upward in vain effort to tear it away. His throat constricted as his breath was shut off. With a wooden fulcrum turning, exerting double strength, he felt his senses beginning to leave him. Blackness rise up to shroud his visions. His legs buckled. But with a final lunge, born of desperation, his right hand reached down and grasped a holstered revolver. He clawed the weapon free, twisted his body sideways, spun the gun barrel down and back, and fired. The shot echoed across the pit. Behind him, Chadwick uttered a low cry and released his grip. The garrote fell free. Blunt swiveled, brought back his left arm, and delivered a final blow. Chadwick fell, almost at the opening of the cairn. In that opening, a third figure now became visible. A girl bound hand and foot, her mouth gagged with a wad of cloth. The sheriff gave a sigh of relief as he saw that she was still alive. And minutes later he assured himself that Emily Hunter was unharmed. He carried her across to the car and lifted her gently into the seat. "Take it easy, miss," he said. "I'll have you out of here in a moment." With Chadwick, he was not so gentle. He saw that his bullet had struck the other man's thigh, and although not serious, was completely incapacitating. Nevertheless, he snapped on handcuffs and half dragged him to the car. He turned the car around and headed up the Virginia road. At the fork, he swung left toward Chaska. "You've been a busy man," he said to Chadwick, "and you'll pay, one way or another, even though you didn't know what you were doing." The Return of Andrew Bentley by August Derleth and Mark Schorer. It is with considerable hesitation that I here chronicle the strange incidents which marked my short stay at the old Wilder homestead on the banks of the Wisconsin River, not far from the rustic village of Sac Prairie. My reluctance is not entirely dispelled by the conviction that some record of these events should emphatically be made, if only to stop the circulation of unfounded rumors which have come into being since my departure from the vicinity. The singular chain of events began with a peremptory letter from my aging uncle, Amos Wilder, ordering me to appear at the homestead, where he was then living with a housekeeper and a caretaker. Communications from my Uncle Amos were not only exceedingly rare, but usually tinged with biting and withering comments about my profession of letters, which he held in great scorn. Previous to this note, we had not seen each other for over 4 years. His curt note hinted that there was something of vital importance to both of us, which he wished to take up with me, and though I had no inkling of what this might be, I did not hesitate to go. The old house was not large. It stood well back in the rambling grounds, its white surface mottled by the shadows of leafy branches in the warm sunlight of the day. on which I arrived. Green shutters crowded upon the windows, and the door was tightly closed despite the day's somnolent warmth. The river was cerulean and silver in the immediate background, and farther beyond the bluffs on the other side of the river rose from behind the trees and were lost in the blue haze of distance to the north and south. My uncle had grown incredibly old, and now hobbled about with the aid of a cane. On the morning of my arrival, he was dressed in a long, ragged black robe that trailed along the floor. Beneath this garment he wore a threadbare black jersey and a pair of shabby trousers. His hair was unkempt, and on his chin was a rough beard, masking his thin, sardonic mouth. His eyes, however, had lost none of their fire, and I felt his disapproval of me as clearly as ever. His expression was that of a man who is faced with an unpleasant but necessary task. At last, after a rude scrutiny, he began to speak, having first made certain that no one lurked within earshot. "It's hardly necessary for me to say I'm not too certain I've done a wise thing in choosing you," he began. "I've always considered you somewhat of a milksop, and you've done nothing to change my opinion." He watched my face closely as he spoke, to detect any resentment that I might feel, but I had heard this kind of speech from him too often before to feel any active anger. He sensed this, apparently, for he went on abruptly. "I'm going to leave everything I've got to you, but there will be a condition. You have to spend most of your time here. Make this your home, of course. And there are one or two other small things you'll have to see to. Mind, I'm not putting anything in my will. I want only your word. Do you think you can give it? Think you can say yes to my terms?" He paused, and I said, "I see no reason why I shouldn't, if you can guarantee that your terms won't interfere with my writing." My uncle smiled and shook his head as if in exasperation. "Nothing is easier," he replied curtly. "Your time for writing will be virtually unlimited." "What do you want me to do?" I asked. "Spend most of your time here, as I said before. Let no day go by during which you do not examine the vault behind the house. My body will lie there, and the vault will be sealed. I want to know that I can depend upon you to prevent anything from entering that vault. If at any time you discover that someone has been tampering, you will find written instructions for your further procedure in my library desk. Will you promise me to attend to these things without too much curiosity concerning them?" I promised, without the slightest hesitation, though there were perplexing thoughts crowding upon my mind. Amos Walder turned away, his eyes glittering. Then he looked through the window directly opposite me and began to chuckle in a curiously guttural tone. At last he set his eyes fixed upon a patch of blue sky beyond the tree near the window. "Good. I'll block him yet. Amos Wilder is still a match for you. Do you hear, Andrew?" With his words, my portender had no means of knowing, for he turned abruptly to me and said in his clipped, curt way, "You must go now, Ellis. I shall not see you again." With that he left the room, and as if by magic, old Jacob Kinney, the caretaker, appeared to show me from the grounds, his face regarding me with apologetic eyes from the doorway through which his master had so abruptly vanished but a moment before. My uncle's strange words puzzled me, and it occurred to me that the old man was losing his mind. That I then did him an injustice I subsequently learned, but at the time all evidence pointed to mental derangement. I finally contented myself with this explanation, though it did not account for the old man's obvious rationality during most of the conversation. 2 points struck me. My uncle had put particular stress upon the suggestion that something might enter his vault. And secondly, what was the meaning of his last words? And to whom was my uncle referring when he said, "I'll block him yet"? And Amos Wilder is still a match for you. Do you hear, Andrew? Conjecture, however, was futile, for since I knew very little of my uncle's personal affairs, any guesses I might have made as to his obscure references, if indeed he was not losing his mind, would be fruitless. I left the old homestead that day in May, only to find myself back there again within 48 hours, summoned by Thomas Weatherby of Sac Prairie, my uncle's solicitor, whose short telegram apprising me of Amos Wilder's death reached me within 3 hours of my return to the St. Louis apartment, which served me as my temporary home. My shock at the news of his sudden death was heightened when I learned that the circumstances surrounding his decease indicated suicide. Weatherby told me the circumstances of my uncle's singular death. It appeared that Jacob Kinney had found the old man in the very room in which he and I had discussed his wishes only a day before. He was seated at the table, apparently asleep. One hand still grasped a pen, and before him lay a sheet of notepaper, upon which he had written my name and address. Nothing more. It was presumed at first that he had had a heart attack, but a medical examination had brought forth the suspicion that the old man had made away with himself by taking an overdose of veronal. There was, however, considerable reluctance to presume suicide, for an overdose of veronal might just as likely be accident as suicide. Eventually, a coroner's jury decided that my uncle had met his death by accident, but from the first I was convinced that Amos Wilder had killed himself. In the light of subsequent events, and of his own cryptic words to me, "I shall not see you again," my suspicion was, I feel, justified, though no definite and conclusive evidence emerged. My uncle was buried as he had wished in the long-disused family vault behind the house, and the vault was sealed from the outside with due ceremony and in the presence of witnesses. The reading of the will was a short affair, for excepting bequests made to the housekeeper and caretaker, I inherited everything. My living was thus assured, and as my uncle had said, I found the future holding many hours of leisure in which to pursue letters. And yet, despite the apparent rosiness of the outlook, there was from the first a peculiar restraint upon my living in the old homestead. It was indefinable and strange, and numerous small incidents occurred to supplement this odd impression. First, old Jacob Kinney wanted to leave. With great effort, I persuaded him to stay, and dragged from him his reason for wanting to go. "There have been mighty strange things a-going on about this house, Mr. Wilder, all the time your uncle was alive, and I'm afraid things will be going on again after a bit." More than that cryptic utterance I could not get out of him. I took the liberty shortly after to repeat Kinney's words to the housekeeper, Mrs. Selden. The startled expression that passed over her countenance did not escape me, and her immediate assurance that Jake Kinney was in his dotage did not entirely reassure me. Then there was the daily function of examining the seal on the vault. The absurdity of my uncle's request began to grow on me, and my task, trivial as it was, became daily more irritating. Yet, having given my promise, I could do no more than fulfill it. On the third night following my uncle's interment, my sleep was troubled to a recurrent dream, which gave me no little thought when I remembered its persistence on the following day. I dreamed that my uncle Amos stood before me, clad as I had last seen him, on the visit just preceding his strange death. He regarded me with his beady eyes, and then abruptly said, in a mournful and yet urgent voice, "You must bring Burkhardt back here. He forgot to protect me against them. You must get him to do so. If he will not, then see those books on the second shelf of the 7th compartment of my library." This dream was repeated several times. It had a perfectly logical basis, which was briefly this. My uncle was buried by Father Burkhardt, the Sac Prairie parish priest, who was not satisfied with the findings of the coroner's jury, and consequently, in the belief that Amos Wilder had killed himself, had refused to bless the grave of a suicide. Yet, what the dream shape of the night before had obviously meant when he spoke of what Father Burkhardt had forgotten to do was the blessing of the grave. I spent some time mulling over the solution of the dream, and at length went to see the priest. My efforts, however, were futile. The old man explained his attitude with great patience, and I was forced to agree with him. On the following night, the dream recurred, and in consequence came a visit to Father Burkhardt, which had already failed to achieve the desired effect. I turned, impelled largely by curiosity, to the books on the second shelf of the 7th compartment indicated by the dream figure of my uncle. From the moment that I opened the first of those books, the entire complexion of the occurrences at the homestead changed inexplicably, and I found myself involved in a chain of incidents the singularity of which continues to impress me even as I write at this late date. For the books on the second shelf of the seventh compartment in my dead uncle's library were books on black magic. Books long out of print and apparently centuries old. For many of them, the print had faded almost to illegibility. The Latin in which most of the books were written was not easily translated, but fortunately it was not necessary for me to search long for the portions indicated by my uncle, for in each book paragraphs were marked for my attention. The subjects of the marked portions were strangely similar. After some difficulty I succeeded in translating the first indicated paragraph to catch my eye. For protection from things that walk in the night, it read, "There are many things stalking abroad by darkness, perhaps ghouls, perhaps evil demons, lured from outer space by man's own ignorance, perhaps souls isolated in space, havenless and alone, and yet strongly attached to the things of this earth. Let no bodies be exposed to their evil wrath. Let there be all manner of protection for vaults and graves, for the dead as well as the living, for ghouls, incubi, and succubi haunt the near places as well as the far, and seek always to quench the fire of their unholy desire. Take blessed water from a church, and mix it with the blood of a young babe, be it ever so small a measure, and with this cross the grave or the door of the vault thrice at the full of the moon." If this was what my uncle Amos desired me to do, and yet once that the task had devolved upon the wrong man, for I could certainly not see myself going about collecting holy water and the blood of a young child, and then performing ridiculous rites over the vault with an odious mixture of the two. I put the books aside and returned to my work, which seemed suddenly more inviting than it had ever been before. Yet what I had read disturbed me, and the suggestion that my uncle had come to believe in the power of black magic, perhaps even more than this, for all I knew, was extremely distasteful to me. In consequence, my writing suffered, and immediately after my supper that evening I went for a long walk on the river bank. A half moon high in the sky made the countryside bright and clear, and since the night was balmy, and made doubly inviting by the sweet mystery of night sounds, the gasping and gurgling of the water, the splashing of distant fish, the muted cries of night birds, particularly the peet-peet of the nighthawk, and the eerie call of the whippoorwill, and the countless mysterious sounds from the underbrush and the river bottoms, I extended my walk much further than I had originally intended, so that it was shortly after midnight when I approached the house again, and the moon was close upon the western horizon. As I came quietly along in the now still night, my eye caught a movement in the shadowy distance. The movement had come from the region of the large old elm which pressed close upon the house, near the library window, and it was upon this tree that I now fixed my eyes. I had not long to wait, for presently a shadow detached itself from the giant bole and went slowly around the house toward the darkness behind. I could see the figure quite clearly, though I did not once catch sight of its face, despite the fact that the man, for man it was, wore no hat. He walked with a slight limp and wore a long black cape. He was near medium height, but quite bent, so that his back was unnaturally hunched. His hands were strikingly white in the fading light of the moon, and he walked with a peculiar, baffling motion, despite his obvious limp. He passed behind the houses with me at his heels, for I was determined to ascertain if possible what design had brought him to the old house. I lost sight of him for a few moments while I gained the shelter of the house, but in a minute I saw him again, and with a gasp of astonishment realized that he was making directly for the vault in which my Uncle Amos lay buried. I stifled an impulse to shout at him, and made my way cautiously in the shadow of a row of lilac bushes towards the vault, before which he was now standing. The darkness here was intense, owing to the fact that the trees from the surrounding copse pressed close upon this corner of the estate, yet I could see from my crouching position that the mysterious intruder was fumbling with the seals of the vault. My purpose in following him so closely was to collar him while he was engaged with his seals, but this design was now for the moment thwarted by stepping back to survey the surface of the vault door. He remained standing in silence for some while, and I had almost decided it might be just as easy to capture him in this position when he moved forward once more. But this time he did not fumble with his heels. Instead, he seemed to flatten himself against the door of the vault. Then, incredible as it may seem, his figure began to grow smaller, to shrink, save for his gaunt and gleaming white fingers and arms. With a strangled gasp, I sprang forward. My memory at this point is not quite clear. I remember seizing the outstretched fingers of the man at the vault door, feeling something within my grasp. Then something struck me at the same moment that the intruder whirled and leaped away. I had the fleeting impression that a second person had leaped upon me from behind. I went down like a log. I came to my senses not quite an hour later and lay for a moment recalling what had happened. I remembered having made a snatch at the intruder's fingers and being struck. There was an appreciable soreness of the head and a sensitive bruise on my forehead when finally I felt for it. But what most drew my attention was the thing that I held tightly in my left hand, the hand which had grasped at the strangely white fingers of the creature pressed against the door of the Wilder vault. I had felt it within my grasp from the first moment of consciousness, but from its roughness I had taken it for a small twig caught up from the lawn. In consequence, it was not until I reached the security of the house that I looked at it. I threw it upon the table in the dim glow of the table lamp, and almost fell in my utter amazement, for the thing I held in my hand was a fragment of human bone, the unmistakable first two joints of the little finger. This discovery loosed a flood of futile conjecture. Was it after all a man I had surprised at the vault, or was it something else? That my uncle was in some way vitally concerned now became apparent, if it had not been entirely so before. The fact that Amos Wilder had looked for such interruption of his repose in the old vault led me to believe that whatever he feared derived from some source in the past. Accordingly, I gave up all conjecture for the time, and promised myself that in the morning I would set on foot inquiries designed to make me familiar with my secluded uncle's past life. I was destined to receive a shock in the morning. Determined to prosecute my curiosity concerning my uncle without loss of time, I summoned Jacob Kinney, whose surliness had noticeably increased during the few days I had been at the old Wilder house. Instead of asking directly about my uncle, I began with a short account of the figure I had seen outside the preceding night. "I was out quite late last night, Jake," I began, "and when I came home I noticed a stranger on the grounds." Kinney's eyebrows shot up in undisguised curiosity, but he said nothing, though he began to exhibit signs of uneasiness which did not escape my notice. He was about 5 feet tall, I would say, and wore no hat. I went on. He wore a long black cape and walked with a slight limp. Abruptly, Kinney came to his feet, his eyes wide with fear. "What's that you say?" he demanded hoarsely. "Walked with a limp? Wore a cape?" I nodded, and would have continued my narrative had not Kinney cried in. "My God!" he exclaimed. "Andrew Bentley's back." "Who's Andrew Bentley?" I asked. But Kinney did not hear. He had whirled abruptly and run from the room as fast as his feeble legs would allow him to go. My astonishment knew no bounds, nor did subsequent events in any way lessen it, for Jacob Kinney ran not only from the house, but from the grounds, and his flight was climaxed shortly after by the appearance of a begrimed youth representing himself as the old man's nephew, who came for Uncle Jake's things. From him I learned that Kinney was leaving his position at once and would forfeit any wages due him, plus any amount I thought fit to recompense me for his precipitous flight. Kinney's unaccountable action served only to sharpen my already keen interest, and I descended upon Mrs. Selden post haste, but the information which she was able to offer me was meager indeed. Andrew Bentley had arrived in the neighborhood only a few years back. He and my uncle had immediately become friends, and the friendship, despite an appearance of strain, had ended only when Bentley mysteriously disappeared about a year ago. She confirmed my description of the figure I had seen as that of Bentley. Mrs. Selden, too, was inexplicably agitated, and when I sought to probe for some source of this agitation, she said only that there were some very strange stories extant about Bentley, and about my uncle as well, and that most of the people in the neighborhood had even relieved of a great fear when Bentley disappeared from the farm adjoining the Wilder estate. This farm, which he had inhabited for the years of his residence, but had not worked, and had yet always managed to exist without trouble, was now uninhabited. This, together with a passing hint that Thomas Weatherby might be able to add something, was the sum of what Mrs. Selden knew. I lost no time in telephoning Weatherby and making an appointment for that afternoon. On the way to the attorney's office, I had ample time to think over the events of the last 10 days. That it was Andrew Bentley whom my uncle had referred to when he spoke so cryptically with me before his death, I had no longer any doubt. Evidently then he too feared his strange neighbor, but how he hoped to thwart any attempt that Bentley might make to get the body, for what reason he might want it, I could not guess. With black magic was beyond my comprehension. Thomas Weatherby was a short and rather insignificant man, but his attitude was conducive to business, and he made clear to me that he had only a limited time at my disposal. I came directly to the matter of Andrew Bentley. Andrew Bentley, began Weatherby with some reluctance, was a man with whom I had no dealings, with whom I cared to have none. I have seldom met any one whose mere presence was so innately evil. Your uncle took up with him, it is true, but I believe regretted it to the end of his days. What exactly was wrong with Bentley? I cut in. Weatherby smiled grimly, regarded me speculatively for a moment or two, and said, Bentley was an avowed sorcerer. Oh, come, I said. That sort of thing isn't believed in any more. But horrible suspicion began to grow in my mind. Perhaps not generally, replied Weatherby at once, but I can assure you that most of us around here believe in the power of black magic, after even so short an acquaintance as ours with Andrew Bentley. Consider for a moment that you have spent the greater part of your life in a modern city, away from the countryside where such beliefs flourish. Wilder. He stopped with an abrupt gesture and took a portfolio from a cabinet. From this he took a photograph, looked at it with a slight curl of disgust in his lips, and passed it over to me. It was a snapshot, apparently of Andrew Bentley, and it had been taken evidently at considerable risk after sunset, for the general appearance of the picture led me to assume that its vagueness was caused by the haziness of dusk, a supposition which Weatherby confirmed. The figure, however, was quite clear, save for blurred arms, which had evidently been moving during the exposure, and for the head. The view had been taken from the side and showed Andrew Bentley, certainly identified for me by the long cape he wore, standing as if in conversation with someone. Yet it struck me as strange that Bentley could have stood quietly during the exposure with no incentive to do so, and I commented upon it at once. Weatherby looked at me queerly. Wilder, he said, there was another person there, or should I say thing? And this thing was directly in line with the lens, for he was standing very close to Bentley. And yet, there is nothing on the snapshot, nor is there any evidence on the exposed negative itself that anyone stood there, for as you can see, the landscape is unbroken. It was as he said. But this other person, I put in, he was seen and yet does not appear. Apparently the camera was out of focus, or the film was defective. On the contrary, there are logical explanations for the non-appearance of something on a film. You can't photograph a dream, and you can't photograph something that has no material form. I say material advisedly, even though our own eyes give that thing a physical being. What do you mean? Father Burkhart would call it a familiar, he said, clipping his words. A familiar, in case you don't know, is an evil spirit summoned by a sorcerer to wait upon his desires. That tall, gaunt man was never seen by day, always by night, and never without Bentley. I can give you no more of my time now, but if you can bring yourself to accept what I have to say at face value, I'll be glad to see you again. My interview with Thomas Weatherby left me considerably shaken, and I found myself discarding all my previously formed beliefs regarding black magic. I went immediately to my late uncle's store of books and began to read through them for further information, in the hope that something I might learn would enable me to meet Andrew Bentley on more equal footing, should he choose to call. I read until far into the night, and what inconceivable knowledge I assimilated lingers clearly in my mind as I write. I read of age-old horrors summoned from the abyss by the ignorance of men, of cosmic ghouls that roam the ether in search of prey, and of countless things that walk by night. There were many legends of familiars, ghastly demons called forth from the depth at the whims of long-dead sorcerers, and it was significant that each legend had been heavily scored along the margins, and in one case the name Andrew Bentley was written in my uncle's hand. In another place my uncle had written, "We are fools to play with powers of whose scope even the wisest of us has no knowledge." It was at this point that it occurred to me that my uncle had left a letter of sealed instructions for me in case the vault was tampered with. This letter was to be in the library desk, where I found it with little trouble, a long legal-looking envelope with my name inscribed very formally. The handwriting was undoubtedly my uncle's, and the letter within was the final thing that finally dispelled all doubt from my mind as to the reality of the sorcery that had been and was still being practiced near the Wilder homestead, for it made clear what had happened between my uncle and Andrew Bentley, and that other. It read, "My dear Ellis, if indeed they have come for me as they must have, if you read this, there is but one thing you can do. Bentley's body must be found and utterly destroyed. Surely there cannot be much left of it now. Perhaps you have seen him in the night when he walks, as I have. He is not alive. I know because I killed him a year ago. Stabbed him with your grandfather's hunting knife, which must yet lie in his black skeleton. I think both Burkhardt and Weatherby suspected that I aided Bentley to his black rites, but that was long before I dreamed of what depth of evil lurked in his soul. And when I began to hound him so, when he brought forward that other, that hellish thing he had conjured up from the nethermost places of evil, could I do otherwise than rid myself of his evil presence? My mind was at stake, and yes, my body. When you read this, only my body is at stake, for they want it. Conceive, if you can, the ghastly irony of my lifeless body given an awful new existence by being inhabited by Bentley's familiar. The body. Bentley's body. I put it in the vault, but that other removed it and hid it somewhere on the grounds. I have not been able to find it, and this past year has been a living hell for me. They have hounded me nightly, and though I can protect myself from them, I cannot stop them from appearing to taunt me. And when I am dead, my protection must come from you. But I hope that Burkhardt will have closed his eyes and blessed the vault. For this I think will be strong enough to keep them away, and yet I cannot tell. And perhaps even this is being read too late. For if once they have my body, destroy me too, with Bentley's remains by fire. Signed, Amos Wilder." I put down this letter and sat for a moment in silence. But what thoughts crowded upon my mind were interrupted by an odd sound from outside the window, a sound that was unnaturally striking in the still night. I glanced at my watch. It was 1 o'clock in the morning. Then I turned out the small reading lamp and quietly went towards the window, immediately beyond which stood the giant elm beneath which was on the previous night I had seen the ghostly figure of Andrew Bentley. For since he had been killed a year before, what I had seen could have been none other than his spectre. Then a thought struck me that paralyzed me with horror. Suppose I had been struck by that other? It seemed to me that the blow which had knocked me out had been struck from behind. At the same instant my eyes caught sight of the faintest movement beyond the window. The moon hung in the hazy sky and threw a faint illumination about the tree, despite the fairly heavy shadow of its overhanging limbs. There was a man pressed close to the bole of the tree, and even as I looked, another seemed to rise up out of the ground at his side, and the second man was Andrew Bentley. I looked again at the first and saw a tall, gaunt figure with malevolent red eyes, through whom I could see the line of moonlight and shadow on the lawn beyond the tree. They stood there together for only a moment and then went quickly around the house toward the vault. From that instant, events moved rapidly to a climax. My eyes fixed themselves upon that place in the ground from which the figure of Andrew Bentley had sprung, and saw there an opening in the trunk of the old tree, for the elm was hollow and its bole held the remains of Andrew Bentley. Small wonder that my uncle had been haunted by the presence of the man he had killed when his remains were hidden in the tree near the library window. But I stood there for only a fraction of a minute. Then I went quickly to the telephone and, after an agonizing delay, got Weatherby on the wire and asked him to come out at once, hinting enough of what was happening to gain his assent. I suggested also that he bring Father Burkhart along, and this he promised to do. Then I slipped silently from the house into the shadowy garden. I think the sight of those two unholy figures hovering about the door of the vault was too much for me, for I launched myself at them, heedless of my danger. But realization came almost instantly, for Andrew Bentley did not even turn at my appearance. Instead, the other looked abruptly around, fixed me with his red and fiery eyes, smiled wickedly so that his leathery face was weirdly creased, and leisurely watched my approach. Instinct, I believe, whirled me about and sent me flying from the garden. The thing was somewhat surprised at my abrupt bolt, and this momentary hesitation on its part I continue to believe is responsible for my being alive to write this. For I knew that I was flying for my life, and I ran with the utmost speed of which I was capable. A fleeting glance showed me that the thing loped after me, a weirdly flapping shape, seeming to come with the wind in the moonlight night, and struck shuddery horror into my heart. I made for the river, because I remembered reading in one of my uncle's old books that certain familiars could not cross water unless accompanied by those whose sorcery had summoned them to earth. I leaped into the cold water, tense with the hope that the thing behind could not follow. It could not. I saw it raging up and down along the river bank, impotent and furious at my fortunate escape, while I kept myself afloat in mid-current. The current carried me rapidly downstream, and I kept my eyes fixed upon the thing I had eluded, until it turned and sped back toward the vault. Only when I was completely out of its sight did I make for the bank once more. I ran madly down the road along which Weatherby and the priest must come, flinging off some of my wet clothes as I went. What was happening at the vault I did not know. At the moment my only thought was temporary safety from the thing whose power I had so thoughtlessly challenged. I had gone perhaps half a mile beyond the estate when the headlights of Weatherby's car swept around a curve and outlined me in the road. The car ground to an emergency stop, and Weatherby's voice called out. I jumped into the car and explained as rapidly as I could what had happened. Father Burkhart regarded me quizzically, half smiling. "You've had a narrow escape, my boy," he said. "A very narrow escape. Now if only we can get to the vault before they succeed in their evil design. Such a fate is too harsh a punishment even for the sins of Amos Wilder." He shuddered as he spoke, and Weatherby's face was grim. None of us wasted a moment when the car came to stop near the house. Father Burkhart, despite his age, led the way, marshalling us behind him, for he went ahead with a crucifix extended. But even as he faltered at the horrifying sight that met our eyes when we rounded the house and came into the garden, for the vault was open, and from it emerged the skeletal Bentley and his familiar, and between them they dragged the lifeless body of my Uncle Amos. Burkhart's hesitation, however, was only momentary, for he ran forward immediately, not were Weatherby and I far behind. At the same moment the two of the vault caught sight of us. With a shrill scream the tall gaunt thing loosed his hold of the corpse and launched himself forward. But the crucifix served us well, for the thing fell shuddering away from it. Father Burkhart immediately pressed his advantage, and following his sharp command, Weatherby and I rushed at Bentley, who had up to this moment remained beside the corpse, still keeping hold of one dead arm. But at our advance Bentley wavered a moment and then turned and took flight, dodging nimbly past us and running for the house. We were at his heels and saw him when he vanished in the deep shadows of the tree near the library window. Father Burkhart presently made his appearance, walking warily, for the thing was still at bay but eager to attack. "Find the bones," directed the priest. "They're in the tree, I suspect." I bent obediently, and presently my searching hand encountered a scooped-out hollow in the trunk just above the opening at the base of the tree. In this lay the skeleton of Andrew Bentley, together with the weapon by which he had met his death, and here it had lain ever since the thing Bentley had summoned from the depth had removed the sorcerer's body from the old vault. Small wonder that it had never been discovered. Father Burkhart stood protectively close while Weatherby and I prepared a pyre to consume the remains of the sorcerer. But what can we do about that? I asked, once pointing to the familiar that now raged in baffled fury just beyond us. We need not bother about that, said the priest. He is held to earth only by the body of the man who summoned him from below. When once that body is destroyed, he must return. That's why they were after your uncle's body. If the familiar could inhabit a body fresh from a new grave, he could walk by day as well as by night, and need have no fear of having to return. Once or twice the thing did rush at us, but each time its charge was arrested by the power of that crucifix held unfalteringly aloft by Father Burkhardt, and each time the thing shrank away, wailing. It was over at last, but not without a short period of ghastly doubt. The remains of Andrew Bentley were reduced to ashes, utterly destroyed, and yet the thing Bentley had called from the outside lingered beyond us, strangely quiet now, regarding us malevolently. I don't understand, admitted Father Burkhardt at last. Now that Bentley's ashes alone remain, the thing should go back into the depths. But if the priest did not understand, I did. Abruptly, I ran to the library window, raised it as far as it would go, and scrambled into the room. In a moment I emerged, bearing the fragment of Bentley's little finger, which I had snatched from the skeletal hand the night before. I threw it into the flames, already dying down in the shadow of the tree. In a moment it had caught fire. At the same time, the thing hovering near us gave us a chilling scream of pain and fury, pushing madly towards us, and then abruptly shot into space and vanished like the last fragment of an unholy, ghastly nightmare. Requiescat in pace, said Father Burkhardt, softly looking at the ashes at our feet, but the dubious expression in his eyes confirmed his belief that for the now released spirit of Andrew Bentley, a greater and longer torture had just begun.